Roger McNamee, you were once part of the Facebook cloth.
I was indeed. I met Mark Zuckerberg when he was 22 years old in 2006. This was in the era before they had news feeds, so it was a tiny little company. And Mark was dealing with a crisis, and one of his executives suggested that he meet with me, and I helped him solve the crisis. And for 3 years thereafter, I was one of his advisors.
And would you at that point have said you were a believer?
Oh, truly. In fact, I was such a believer, I helped to bring Sheryl Sandberg into Facebook. And even when I stopped being an insider in 2009, I remained an enormous fan. I believed in Facebook as a force for good, and there was no reason why it should ever have come off of the good path. And when I first saw the problems in 2016, I was astonished because it had not occurred to me that a platform that brought people together could also be used to drive them apart.
But what was it that led you not to continue with Facebook? Because after all, you left at a point where it was just becoming possible that it might become something very big, very successful, something totally all-embracing.
It's a great question. Entrepreneurs in technology companies have different needs at different stages of the corporate life. And my skill sets were best applied in those early days of Facebook. And so in a sense, Mark came to a point where he had a different set of needs and where I was no longer the right person to do it. The business became operational, and once it became operational, there were much better people for him to turn to, and so that's what happened. So I voluntarily withdrew and became just a cheerleader, and I remained a very active cheerleader and an investor in the company. My firm was an investor in the company. And when I first observed issues which were in the context of the US presidential election in 2016, at the very beginning of the Democratic primary, and I saw things that looked inauthentic to me related to the Bernie Sanders campaign.
Give me an example.
So initially, what I saw were Facebook groups that claimed to be associated with Bernie Sanders that were distributing essentially hate speech. They were images of Hillary Clinton depicting her in totally inappropriate ways that no campaign would associate itself with, or at least I didn't think would associate itself with at that time.
But they were bad people who'd hijacked a good entity.
Well, I think it's possible, we have never confirmed this, that this was one of the Russian false flag accounts. And then subsequently, about 2 months later, in March of 2016, I saw a civil rights violation related to Black Lives Matter, where a corporation was using the advertising tools of Facebook to gather names and addresses of people who expressed an interest in the Black Lives Matter civil rights movement. They were selling it to police departments in violation of the US law. And Facebook did the correct thing. They expelled the company, but the damage had been done, and I thought that was really evil. And then, of course, Brexit in June of 2016. That was the first time I realized, oh my gosh, the same advertising tools that allow Procter & Gamble and other companies to sell so successfully, when applied to an election, can be used in really dangerous and anti-democratic ways. And that was when I realized there was something structurally wrong. And I did research and then reached out to Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg in October of 2016 to say, I was convinced that the business model and algorithms of Facebook were structurally flawed in a way that allowed bad people to harm innocent people, and that I thought that it was potentially catastrophic, and they needed to get right on it. And
they took this as a hostile?
No, but they did not take it seriously. They treat us as a public relations issue as opposed to a structural issue. Mm-hmm. And keep in mind, at that point, they'd gone about 5 years where everything had seemingly gone perfectly. And in a sense, they probably looked at me and said, Roger, if you're so smart, where are your 2 billion monthly users, right? That they're looking at this going, the world have been telling me they're the smartest people on earth for 5 years, and they just assumed I was wrong. And I don't think it's that they certainly didn't view me as hostile, because I didn't come to them that way at all. But they humored me and had one of their key executives, a person who was a friend of mine, work with me for 3 months. And yet they always took the position that the law in the United States classified Facebook as a platform, not a media company, which meant that they were legally not responsible for the actions of third parties. And my response to that before the election was, I'm sorry, but if there are civil rights violations and issues in democracy, people may not let you get away with that. And then after the US presidential election, I said to them, hang on, you've got elections in the United Kingdom and the United States where you may have played a role that you did not intend to play in the outcome. And you're in a business based on trust. And I just advised them to do what Johnson & Johnson did after that man poisoned bottles of Tylenol in 1982, which is to don't wait for the government to tell you what to do. Jump to protect the people who use your product. Protect that trust first and foremost. And I'm doing this as a friend, right? And for whatever reason, they just didn't see it. I was the wrong messenger. Maybe the message wasn't quite right, but they just said the law protects us, we don't have a problem.
But did what you'd warned them of, and which they fundamentally ignored and thought you were wrong about, did they come eventually to embrace it and themselves begin to be poisoned by it?
No, I don't. Here's what really bothers me. I believe that through the 2016 elections, both Brexit and the United States, that they were unconscious of the ways their products were being used. Where I fault them is that when evidence came to light that proved conclusively that bad actors had used the product to distort elections, to harm civil rights, to cause all kinds of other problems, to invade privacy, their first reaction was not to solve the problem, but rather to deny, to deflect, to dissemble, and to essentially use public relations as an alternative to solving the underlying problem. And that makes me incredibly sad because the Mark and Cheryl that I knew, those are good people. And they were driven, they were focused, they maybe didn't have the broadest understanding of their responsibility in the world, but I thought they were really capable of adapting to that, and they proved not to be.
You see, if we come forward, to the last couple of years, when we exposed the Cambridge Analytica issue, we got exactly the same response.
Precisely the same response.
So,
which is what makes me so sad, right? Because
but by now, we're therefore talking about a company, an entity in Facebook that understood that bad things were happening, but said it was
indisputably
nothing to do with us.
Indisputably. In fact, the world owes Channel 4 a debt of gratitude because that story crystallized in the public imagination the problems that I had been talking about, where we had been unsuccessful in getting awareness above some very low level. And then suddenly the Cambridge Analytica story combined not only the threat to democracy, but the gross violations of people's personal privacy, and in a nice, easy to understand story. And when that happened, I was really hopeful that the employees of Facebook would insist.
Or that Zuckerberg himself, I mean, after
exactly.
all, Zuckerberg was called for by the British Commons, House of Commons, to attend and give evidence. He refused.
And I wish that...
Is that the point at which we say, look, that's the point at which Facebook was not prepared to face up to the realities of the bad things that it was facilitating?
And I would argue that the correct response there would have been to say, fine, we will shut you down in the United Kingdom until you come and testify. Because the consequences we're talking about here to the public health of our children, right? We think about body shaming on Instagram of preteens, and you look at the whole bullying that takes place of teenagers. Then you look at all the things with adults.
But I have to stop you there because, I mean, the idea that any government in the Western world would now move to shut down Facebook until the moment in which it had sorted out the things that were going wrong on its watch. I mean, you'd have people at their throats.
Well, I think that has been the challenge for people like me, is to make people aware of what we're up against here. Because we have not seen the limits of the ambition of these companies. And if the issue were just that something had gone wrong in 2016 that affected the outcome of the Brexit referendum and the US presidential election, and people will debate both sides of that, and I'm not actually interested in relitigating. If those were isolated things, then that would be the correct response. The problem is that Facebook, Google, Microsoft, and Amazon, which are the big players in the business model we're talking about here, have not taken any steps to protect democracy, public health, privacy, or even innovation in our economies. That they act like monopolists who are not accountable, who should not be held responsible for the consequences of their actions.
But look, you worked with Mark Zuckerberg
I did.
before all this. You know, you must know him well enough to know, is this a complete naive who can't cope with what happens when the practicalities hit the fan? Is it somebody who's so far above the clouds that he can't see what's going on?
I don't want to pretend that I know Mark well now, okay? 10 years have passed since we were really intimate. But I think there are a couple things going on. Mark had a vision of connecting the whole world on one network.
Sure.
Facebook had bought into that vision so completely that they basically took a position that that was the most important thing on earth, and it justified whatever actions were necessary. You look at these things, and in my mind, the notion that these companies are not accountable is ridiculous. That this is like the chemical industry in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, which was super profitable, high growth industry because they poured their waste products anywhere they felt like. So they put mercury into fresh water, and they would have spills, and they were never held accountable for it. And eventually society said, you know, you caused this problem, you need to pay the cost. And what I'm suggesting here is that if we're going to have a functioning democracy, if we're going to have functioning countries, these companies have to pay the cost of the damage that they're doing.
But the problem, I think, that one has to recognize is the scale of Facebook, of Google, of Microsoft is now so big that it's transnational.
It is.
And it is beyond the capacity of any one state to do anything about it. Isn't that the case?
No, I think it works differently than that. I believe that each state has the power to do what it wants to do for its own situation.
And alienate its population in doing it.
Sri Lanka, after a terrorist act and then after hate speech, each time shut down internet platforms temporarily in order to get some assistance in dealing with the problem. And in my
Not for very long, though.
and I'm not suggesting it should ever be for very long. I think if the United Kingdom were to shut Facebook down until Mark testified, Mark would testify very quickly. I don't think that's, I think his...
Well, why do you think the state doesn't do that?
Because for the very reason you described, which is that the citizens do not appreciate yet how much damage is being done. And that's really the fault of people like me, that our job is to communicate the message. And it's hard to imagine, we think that the deal we have is we give up a little personal data for a great service. And we get targeted ads. But that's not what's going on anymore. These companies now, they create a little data voodoo doll in each and every one of us. Most of the data isn't what you put in. 99% of it's data they get from surveillance systems, tracking you online, having Alexa and things like that, but also buying your intimate financial data from your bank, your credit rating agency, your credit card processor, your health data, your location data. They can make predictions about what you're going to do. And that's very scary and dangerous.
If you look at our constitutional crisis at the moment, the whole system is creaking. You've got judges involved.
Same thing in the United States.
You've got commons prorogued. The thing is in real tension. And now you're saying, amid all this, the government of the day has to shut down Facebook and sort this out.
Well, to be clear, the issues you're dealing with constitutionally are enabled by platforms like Facebook, like Google. And in fact, almost all
You mean you're tracking us back to the point at which Brexit was ever even tested?
And I would point to worse than that. I think the biggest barrier to doing something about climate change is that internet platforms allow climate change deniers to have disproportionate political influence. The same thing is true with anti-vax, white supremacy, gun violence. Almost all the biggest issues in the United States are intractable in large part because small minorities are able to have disproportionate influence. And the reason that that works is that these products are about holding our attention. And for most of us, the things that hold our attention best are posts that trigger flight or fight. And what are those? Hate speech, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. These are not a byproduct of the business model. They are the business model.
You imagine that you pop down to Downing Street, you knock on the door to see Mr. Johnson, and the door is opened by Dominic Cummings. Now, you want to petition that something be done about the unlimited and damaging power of these big Facebook entities. You're not going to get anywhere, are you?
I'm not, which is why I have to do this with the citizens of the United Kingdom. My job is to communicate to the citizens that you're not going to lose the things you like on the internet. Facebook, Google, Microsoft provided those services before they had this business model. And the business model is all about taking your life, converting it into data, and then controlling the choices available to you. And that notion, which Professor Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, is such a successful business model that's unrelated to the products you like. The products you like are simply they're the way that they control your choices because you trust Google search results. You trust the Facebook newsfeed, and you should not. Those things are being massaged according to what they know from your data voodoo doll. So your choices are being narrowed to their interests, not yours. And I look at that and I go, at the end of the day, people do not have to believe me. What I want them to do is to imagine, what if I were right? Run a thought experiment. If I'm correct, what's the right thing for each and every one of us to do? Could we take a little bit of pain now for a much better future? Because I believe that these companies unintentionally in the beginning and now as a business model are making politics more or less impossible in democracy.
Exactly. And when it comes to Brexit, in our own case, do you have the same?
I don't.
No.
I don't.
But you suspect?
I know that these platforms were used very, very effectively by one side. Exactly how they were used, I don't know. But my observation to you is this. I don't think it ever occurred to the people at Facebook or Google that their platforms would affect the outcome of an election until it happened. To me, the way that it went down is such that they had every incentive to make substantive changes in the way they do business to protect democracy. They have to live somewhere. And yet the changes that they've made have been purely superficial and not going after the core problems. They've essentially put a Band-Aid over examples of what happened in 2016.
So if your one-time friend, Mark Zuckerberg, were sitting here, what would you say he had to do right now to guard against the destruction of democracy, as you have described it?
I'll give you two ways of looking at it. The first is if you want to solve the problem structurally, he could solve all the problems, the privacy problems, the democracy problems, and the public health problems, by recognizing that the business model of converting people's lives into data and then using that to manipulate their behavior, that's just morally wrong. And I would package it this way. I'd say, Mark, you can do more good by reforming Facebook's business model than you can with 1,000 Chan Zuckerberg initiatives, which are his charitable foundation.
What would it cost him to do it?
Oh, it would cost Facebook a lot, earnings-wise.
They have a lot.
But they have a lot. And importantly, what does Mark have to lose? He can be the hero in his own story. And the same is true of Google, that you shouldn't have search results under Holocaust that basically focus on it not having happened. And yet these things persist. And you shouldn't have all the harm being done to children on YouTube Kids. And you shouldn't have all the things for school-age children.
But you know better than I that this flies in the face of their, you can't censor, you can't interfere with.
So I want to make an important point about this. I don't want to censor them. What I want to do is to change the way their algorithms work. This isn't about denying freedom of speech. It's about denying amplification for hate speech, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. If Alex Jones, who was the American conspiracy theorist, got 15 billion recommendations on YouTube, there is no way on earth that those recommendations were good for society. He is a conspiracy theorist. I don't want to censor Alex Jones, but I don't want to give his speech amplification that's greater than the sum of the 4 largest media outlets in the United States combined.
But you are therefore sort of saying that these big platforms have to censor some of their content.
No, I'm saying that it's about amplification, which is different than censoring. If you want to go find Alex Jones content for yourself, that's fine. They're pushing it on everybody. There was this thing that they called 3 degrees of Alex Jones, which was a bit of snark. That the notion was that no matter where you started in YouTube, within your 3rd recommendation, you'd be at an Alex Jones video. I mean, that wasn't strictly accurate. It was a joke, but it was directionally correct because they were recommending him as the answer for questions that were unrelated to him. Why? Because people would watch it and then they watch more. And so the result is that they have undue influence because their business model encourages them to promote the least desirable content.
But you are saying that if you take the Alex Jones example, that there would have to be a facility within Facebook to prevent bad stuff like Alex Jones going the way you've described.
Well, I would say that the business model itself is flawed, and it's this notion that you want to prey on the weakest elements of human psychology. The fact that people respond to hate speech, not because they like it, but because it provokes a flight or fight response.
But in a sense, you're asking the people who've got us into this mess to be entrusted with the capacity to choose what has not got to be on their platform.
And what I'm saying is, I think you're going to have to do this with government regulation, that the simplest way to do it is to eliminate their ability to buy all of the personal data and to use surveillance to gather all this personal data on people. Right now, I would say that each one of us, the data voodoo doll for each one of us, is like a bodily organ that we do not control. It's part of our lives, and it can be used to affect our choices, and yet we have no control of it, no say over it. So you're right, rather than trying to regulate the amplification, what I'd rather do is eliminate the business model entirely by preventing they and everyone else from trading financial data, health data, location data, and anything that takes place in your home or in your car. That, Alexa shouldn't be able to gather audio from all these different parts of your life.
But you're entrusting the state with enormous trust and control capacities.
Think of it as negative. No, again, I think this is, no, I disagree with, I don't call it censorship, because censorship is denying the right to speak. And in this case, I'm denying the right to amplify the unpleasant stuff. And I'm saying that we as human beings are entitled to control our digital selves. And,
But you see, if I could look at our own situation, there are people within the administration here in Britain who are very deeply involved in the tech and communications world. I mean, because they're using it to campaign and the rest of it. They're not exactly going to leap up and say, sure, we better stop this bad stuff.
No, I'm with you.
So I'm not sure where you find the state that is going to do this.
I don't know where I'm going to find it either. which is why I'm in a campaign of trying to make citizens everywhere aware. Let me give you the thing that I think is most frightening. Google is a company of brilliant people. They realized 20 years ago that they could convert human experience into data and use that to make themselves very wealthy. So they started to look at life events: purchase of a car, purchase of a home, getting married, a woman getting pregnant. And they would look at those life events and then look at every step, thousands of steps that come before, and looked for patterns. And they got so good at that, they can now predict with roughly 90% confidence that a woman is pregnant before she knows. Now, you say to yourself, well, what's the harm in that? So you get an ad for diapers before you realize you're pregnant. If that's all it was, that would be fine. But Google will sell access to that information to anybody. So even anti-vax people can have access to it. And I think we can all agree that going after a woman who does not know she's pregnant with anti-vax material is not in the interest of society. And if I were the woman, the notion that Google knows that I'm pregnant before I do would make me concerned. And do they know it all the time? Obviously not. But can they do it with a high enough probability to build a business around it? Yes. And you say to yourself, is that really the kind of world we want to live in? Do we want to live in a world where I don't want governments, I don't want corporations taking our liberty away because they have access to data and control of data that it should be ours? And I'm with you. Democracies like the United States, like the United Kingdom, are going to have to rebuild themselves. And one of the principles I'd like to rebuild around is this notion of returning to the idea of individual liberty and the notion of individual control of your own destiny.
You are appealing to the citizen.
Yes, that's my
goal. And the citizen has got way off this concern for their safety that you're discussing.
I agree.
And is still absolutely mesmerized by what they can find out on the, and it's so difficult to see how you're going to undermine that, how you're going to...
Well, to be clear, I'm not sure I will. What I'm saying here, though, is when I began this journey in early 2016, you could count on your hands the number of people who were aware of the problem. A year later, you could count in the hundreds or low thousands. Thanks to you and to the others who broke Cambridge Analytica, we took that number to hundreds of millions globally. There's much more awareness. There's not always complete understanding. And that's understandable. These are complex issues. And what I'm saying to people is, we're going to have to rebuild our democracies. If we want our democracies, we're going to have to engage more as citizens than we used to. While we're doing that, let's recognize that technology is both part of the problem and potentially part of the solution. But if it's going to be part of the solution, it needs to be operated in a way that serves the public interest. That technology in the days when I joined Silicon Valley in the early 80s, technology was about empowering the people who used it. And today, we're the fuel. We're just a source of data to them.
So, Roger, a lot of people have been listening to you, and they're going to be asking one question. What do I have to do? I, the citizen, me, alone.
Only effective tool we have right now is politics. And in the United States, a country that is as polarized as it's ever been, there is one issue that cuts across party lines, and it is this issue. And I believe that's going to turn out to be true in every country. That at the end of the day, there are 1 million people who work for Facebook, Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, the vast majority in the United States. Everyone else is on the other side of this issue because we're the fuel for the business model that has made them staggeringly rich and influential to a degree that no corporations in history have ever experienced. And I believe there's an opportunity for each and every one of us, because we have democratic elections coming up. You'll wind up with either a referendum or a new general election in the UK.
Either of which may have been fiddled about with, but anyway.
But in 2020, we're going to have the same thing in the United States. And each one of us needs to recognize that our participation is mandatory this time, that we have to set turnout records because we may not get a lot of other choices. And we have wildly more influence on the outcome than we've been led to believe. Because if everybody turns out, then you get a fair vote. And then whatever the consequence of that is, whatever people choose to vote, well, then that's the answer. Where we run into the problem is if you can suppress the vote so that it distorts the outcome, that's the terrible thing. You know, I'm not telling people how to vote, I'm just saying get involved. And, you know, if your member of parliament is campaigning or somebody's campaigning in your community, ask them a really simple set of questions. Why is it legal for people who operate email or documents products like Microsoft or Google to scan your documents or emails for their economic benefit? Why is that? And if they were in a postal service or a phone company, that would be a felony. Why is anyone allowed to capture data on minors? I mean, Microsoft starts with Minecraft when children are in primary school. Google starts in primary school with both YouTube Kids and with Chromebooks. And so when I look at these things, I'm going, there are a whole series of issues like that. I mean, why in the United States, there's a loophole that allows people to trade health information online. I mean, that's insane. We need our elected representatives to do their job and represent us and to protect us. This is a clear and present danger. This is, you know, I don't see how this is all that different from the kinds of experiences the wars have created or that massive environmental damage does.
Roger McNamee, thank you very much for talking to us.
John, what a pleasure to be here.